So maybe I'll learn a few things from our young man who is going to be helping us out. We will keep everyone muted throughout this presentation, and then we'll direct you to unmute yourself.
It's going now. Do you want to hear it or not?
We'll direct you to unmute yourself when it's time for questions at the end. So I'd like to introduce Rick Gold, who will introduce our speaker for today. Thank you for being here.
And thank you, Julianne, for everything you do for ILR. So I'm Rick Gold, and welcome to a four-class session called the LGBTQ Struggle in Florida. As someone committed professionally and personally to human rights, I've been an advocate and ally for the LGBTQ community for decades. In 1993, I protested against General Colin Powell, who supported the Clinton administration's proposed Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, which barred openly gay, lesbian, or bisexual persons from military service. I appreciated President Obama's efforts to advance LGBTQ rights, but I'm appalled at the damage President Trump has done in this area. As a retired Foreign Service officer for the U.S. Agency for International Development, I was happy that Obama committed to integrating the pursuit of LGBTQ rights into U.S. foreign policy. Before heads of state at the UN, he said, "No country should deny people their rights because of who they love, which is why we must stand up for the rights of gays and lesbians everywhere." The Obama administration made extraordinary, but of course insufficient progress in many areas affecting LGBTQ rights in the US. He worked with Congress to extend hate crime coverage to attacks on victims' sexual orientation or gender identity. Under the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, insurers could not discriminate against LGBTQ persons. He worked with Congress to repeal the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy. Following two Supreme Court decisions, the Obama administration ensured that over 1,000 laws and regulations recognized the rights of same-sex couples and assured that the Internal Revenue Service and Social Security Administration recognized same-sex marriages. President Obama also protected LGBTQ Americans from discrimination through actions to prohibit federal contractors, schools, and employers from discriminating against them. He also ensured LGBTQ equality in housing and crime prevention. President Trump actually came into office stating his intention to protect the rights of all Americans, including the LGBTQ community. But in fact, he worked actively to reduce these rights. He prohibited the military from engaging new transgender members. His Justice Department said that the Civil Rights Act does not protect transgender people from discrimination, and argued in court that employers could legally discriminate based on sexual orientation and gender identity. The Trump administration allowed contractors and federally funded healthcare providers to discriminate against LGBTQ if treating them equally would conflict with their religious beliefs. The Justice Department rescinded guidance to schools on including trans students and declined to enforce civil rights law for LGBTQ students.
Make it black. Unless you're going to sit. Will you sit here?
I'm going to mute everyone.
I will come back, but I can't.
Good job, Rick. I think people are coming in late, so you'll have to keep an eye on it.
Okay, very good. The the Health and Human Services proposed rules to remove LGBTQ discrimination under the Affordable Care Act, Medicare, Medicaid, and private insurance. The Trump administration also removed transgender protections for equal access to homeless shelters, allowed adoption and foster care providers to discriminate against LGBTQ persons, and required trans prisoners to be imprisoned according to their biological sex. And as you probably remember, the Trump administration supported the Supreme Court case of a baker who refused to make a cake for LGBTQ persons for religious reasons. The House of Representatives passed the Equality Act, which would provide civil rights protections to LGBTQ persons and prohibit discrimination for gender identity and sexual orientation. But the Trump administration opposed the Equality Act, which hasn't passed the Senate. So all of these advances, as well as the retrenchment that we've seen on LGBTQ rights, have resulted from nationwide efforts of the LGBTQ movement and their allies. These groups have also focused on the state and local levels. This course will examine the history of these struggles. Today, we'll look at the history of the LGBTQ movement in Alachua County. Excuse me. Next week, we'll look at the actions in response to the Johns Committee, which persecuted hundreds of LGBTQ persons at state universities and schools in the 1950s. On January 25th, we'll examine the history and current priorities of organizations advocating for LGBTQ rights in Florida. Finally, on February 1st, we'll explore efforts by UF to support LGBTQ efforts and to address their concerns. Let me introduce Bob Karp, who will guide us on the history of the LGBTQ movement in Alachua County. Bob attended UF in 1977 as an undergraduate, and in 1981 graduated with a bachelor's degree in sociology. He became a community activist focused on LGBTQ rights and other progressive issues beginning in the 1990s. In 1993, he co-founded the Human Rights Council of North Central Florida, a local LGBTQ rights advocacy organization. And he continues to serve on its board of directors today. Bob? Go ahead. Unmute yourself, please.
There we go. Hey, thank you so much, Rick, for that introduction. And I do want to thank you, Rick, for organizing this. And it sounds like an amazing series. Don't miss the Johns Committee one, by all means. That is a fascinating history, among others. And I do want to thank my friend Margaret Boonstra, who asked me to participate, and I'm really happy to do so. So let me just get my notes back up here. So what I think I want to do is I just want to give you from a personal history of someone that was involved personally in a lot of this LGBTQ struggle, especially starting in the 90s. And also I got to witness a lot of other community activists as well. I certainly wasn't the only one. There were many, many people. But I think, and what's going to happen is I've created a little slideshow that I gave Rick that he's going to show you in a minute or so. And it's just to give you a feel from newspaper clippings and photographs and even cartoons of what it was like in the early 90s when this sort of struggle really took off. And I'm going to speak about that, and then I'm also going to speak about what happened with the City Commission as well in the 2000s as well, sort of two parts of LGBT history in Gainesville and Alachua County. So that said, I just want to tell you that as Rick said, I did come here as a student in 1977, 17 years old. And I actually do remember in 1981, when I just graduated, that the city of Gainesville actually did have a vote on passing their own gay rights, what they would just call a gay rights ordinance at that time. And actually it didn't get much publicity at all, but it did go down on a 4-to-1 vote. It was defeated. The one vote, by the way, you may know, was the Mayor Commissioner Bobby Lyle, who actually is now deceased just a few years ago. But she was actually a closeted lesbian at that time, but she was the one sole vote in favor out of the 5 at that point. So now fast forward to the early 90s, and Rick, if you want to begin that, showing some of those from that PDF. What really happened is that in 1991, Tampa actually passed an ordinance. It was just called a gay rights ordinance at that time. And it just sort of occurred to folks here in Gainesville, like, well, we should have one of these. I mean, why we don't have protections here in Gainesville for LGBT people. And really at that time, frankly, the T was not even thought about. So it was generally described as lesbian, gay, and bisexual people. And what happened is two folks from a local NOW group, a National Organization for Women, went to the city commission and went to the county commission and asked that these protections be considered. And the county commission then sent it to a committee, which is their Equal Opportunity Committee. And so this was the first time that they held public hearings on this. It got some attention. We got organized in the gay and lesbian community and attended those things. And a lot of what the question was at the very beginning was like, well, why do we need this? Like, does discrimination exist? Why, is it really necessary? What about other towns that are similar in other counties that have this? And, in those days in 1990, there weren't a lot of places, especially in the Southeast, that had this. There were some in South Florida. And as I said, Tampa had just passed it. And the other thing, of course, you have to remember is that there wasn't the internet really like we have it today. Email was just sort of beginning. And so you couldn't just get on the internet and find all this information. Are there surveys of discrimination, this and that? What cities, what counties, have these ordinances? So we pretty much had to start from scratch. And the first thing we did was find information. What I did, and the first thing that I did is I said, hey, I'm a sociology major. I like surveying people about topics. And I said, let's survey the lesbian and gay community about discrimination. So that was one of the first things that we did. And it was really fascinating. It was actually fairly easy to do. And it got a lot of press, where I found that, say, like 29% of gay people experience discrimination at the job, or maybe 15% experience discrimination in renting or housing. And this was information that we put in a packet. We had testimonials for people. We had lists of other cities and counties around the country that had these ordinances and what they covered. And we just submitted this whole packet to this committee. So anyhow, so that went fine. And then we get to, okay, well, it's getting toward the point when the county's going to consider it. But during this time, it just so happened that the city commission, things were happening there as well. And one thing that we did is we thought, wouldn't it be nice to have a gay pride event, like which is actually fairly common in some other larger cities. Usually happens in June, which is when the Stonewall riots had occurred. And so we asked them, and sure enough, the city commission said, yeah, sure, we'll have a proclamation for a gay pride week. And by the way, we even have banners you can put up on city lampposts. And we said, sure, we would like to do that. Well, that suddenly got sort of the city commission involved. And at that point, some of the more conservative commissioners on the commission, remember there were 5 commissioners at that point, were not happy with this. And they got a lot of pushback, especially from a lot of Christian conservatives. Many of them were, belonged to Christian business groups and things like that. And what happened was that one of the commissioners, and it's the late Court Collier, which you might remember, had been a longtime commissioner, actually developed with some other folks an official resolution of the city of Gainesville that basically urged the county commission not to pass this. And sort of unusual to do a resolution urging another body not to do something. It's not unheard of, but a little unusual. But they decided to sort of get into that, what was happening over across the street at the county commission. And what happened was, and this was in June of 1992 now, and it basically, there was a little bit of a flame going on this issue, but that just put gasoline on the flame. And this resolution, if you haven't heard about it, it's still, when I read it today, it just gives me the chills. But it was adopted on a 3-2 vote, and it included language associating gay people with bestiality and necrophilia and pedophilia and sodomy, and that we were criminals because of the sex acts that we do. And it was just like, it pulled out every sort of anti-gay trope that you could imagine, that probably going back to the Victorian era in England. I mean, and this was just kind of shocked everybody, not just gay people, many straight allies as well, were just like, this is Gainesville. And one of the things about at that time was that, you know, when we started pushing for gay rights protections, people just said, like, in Gainesville, in Alachua County, don't we already have that? Isn't that illegal already? And people just assumed that this was sort of a liberal, progressive community, and those protections were already there, but in fact they weren't. And not only weren't they not there, but now our city commission was showing that they really didn't like gay people, and they made it an official resolution to say that. Well, that certainly is what sparked, I think, folks in the LGBT community to come out even more. And it really showed that, you know, we had a lot of educating to doing. We had to get a lot of new people elected to office as well. And we just certainly had to stand up and say, hey, we're here, we're part of the community, and we deserve equal rights like anyone else. Now, speaking of equal rights, one of the other messages that was used by the opponents of these ordinances was that it was special rights. That was a very big deal back then. It's that somehow we were asking for something more than what other people were getting, and something extra, something special. And this was a fairly effective talking point. And quite often even supporters would say, well, I kind of support you, but I don't think, you know, local cities and counties should be getting into the act of this, and, you know, only the federal government. So go to Congress and get them to change the Federal Civil Rights Act. But of course, that was not happening with Congress. And we know that a lot of this stuff has to start with the grassroots. And we continued our push. Well, so June 1992, if there was one month in all of LGBT history that was just an incredible month when everything happened, it was June of 1992. So not only at the beginning did we have that anti-gay resolution from the city commission, but following that, literally at that meeting, as it approached midnight at City Hall, and I was there that night, there was a sit-in. 50 people actually sat in, would not leave the meeting. 2 hours after the meeting, it's getting to be like 2 in the morning. Finally, the police come in and say, we're going to drag you out and we're going to arrest you. And 15, a lot of people did leave, but about 15 people were taken out and taken to jail. And that just sort of exploded after the meeting. And I think it just shows you how upset folks were. And it's really hard to describe, you know, being targeted like that by your elected officials. You know, to this day, it still kind of amazes me. So that happened, and that was sort of going on. And no, they didn't take a plea deal several months later, and they actually went to trial. And actually, several months later, were convicted actually of disorderly conduct. So that was sort of happening in the background. At the same time, we thought, well, we're going to have a gay pride picnic. And we called it a picnic because it was at West Side Park, the very first one. And we knew that other cities did that. And we thought, we need to do that. It's just part of showing who we are. And we thought, what's more normal, you know, just regular kind of thing to do than a picnic at West Side Park? Well, that turned out to be, to really get a lot of people upset. And we got now on the radar of the Ku Klux Klan. And we know they exist, you know, in areas south of us, and especially in areas around Stark and Lottie. That was not that was well known. But sure enough, I can't believe we did this in only a matter of 3 or 4 weeks. But at the end of June, we had a pride picnic, and sure enough, the Klan showed up. And Rick, if you want to start rolling these maybe about every 15 or 20 seconds, we actually will get to some of this. And what happened is I actually co-planned this picnic with a friend of mine, and sure enough, I actually met with some of GPD who said the Klan's going to be there, and they wanted to, and they're very good kind of working with us about that. And they tried to separate the groups. They didn't want any violence or anything like that. So sure enough, at the corner of 34th and University, and I don't know if anyone remembers that, but the Ku Klux Klan with the whole gear and everything was out there, you know, protesting. And in fact, they were even holding flyers that said "Death to homosexuals." And you know, they don't kid around about their beliefs. And then that was sort of interesting because we had sort of a nice little picnic on the one side toward the building, a little bit of music going on, things like that. And then all of a sudden, Sadie Darnell runs over to me and says, "Bob," and Sadie Darnell was, of course, you know, working with the GPD at that time. And she said, "You got to come here. You got to come here." And I thought, "Oh my God, what's going on?" Well, it turns out she wanted to introduce me to her cousin who happened to be in town, and it was Tom Petty. And Tom Petty and his wife had shown up just out of the blue. I mean, we did not even know this. In fact, they were living in LA, but just happened to be visiting, and they really wanted to show their support of us. And we'll see a photo coming up about that, and it has sort of it's my back to them. But that was quite an interesting thing, and certainly made the papers as far as that. So that worked out. There's interesting also a photo in the Sun the next day of two women that were kissing in front of the KKK members, and it's so funny because they got such a backlash about having two women kissing on the front page of the Sun that people were canceling their subscriptions and thought it was like, oh my God, this isn't a family-friendly newspaper, and the Sun had to like give a special explanation why they did it and everything, and it's kind of amazing to think of this day, but that's what it was like back then. So that was happening. We also had in June one other thing, and this is, by the way, that resolution that I was talking about that really was just shocking in 1992. But what we also had in June was a protest march, or really just a march in support of gay rights. And this was on an evening. It was a beautiful day in mid June, and it started actually with a vigil with religious leaders at St. Augustine's Church, kind of right across from campus there. And we had no idea how many people would show up. Remember, this is pretty much before email and certainly before the internet. And it was just getting on the phone and calling people is what you did. And we had no idea how many people were going to show up, and we were going to march down University Avenue. And first time ever that we've done this and make it to the county commission building. And sure, it turned up about almost 1,000 people had shown up at this march. We were just couldn't believe it. And so I was there for that vigil, and then we marched down the street, and GPD was really great. A lot of opponents were actually doing their new video, were taking video camera footage of us because they thought they would like scare us because we would be perhaps on some video somewhere. Because, you know, being out was still a big deal for a lot of gay and lesbian people then. But sure enough, yeah, and that's part of the rally that you're looking at right there. We went to, I remember we got to University in Maine, and we just literally, there were so many people took over the entire intersection. This is like around, 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening. And one of the leaders, Claire Gibert, got on top, kind of stood on that where on that pedestal right next to where the old Confederate soldier was, I remember, and gave quite a rousing speech. And I learned actually that the law enforcement was actually had already signed papers for a civil emergency. I mean, they really thought we were going to like riot. I mean, you could actually see it in their faces, kind of looking at us like they were ready to just, you know, come on down hard. But nobody had any intention of that. We just simply wanted to be visible and to make some noise and make sure people knew that this was important to us. But again, that's the way it was back in 1992. So basically, that really put us on the map in June of '92. And what happened is then now we kind of make it into the next year, and we have a recommendation from the EO committee and to actually pass this thing at the county level. And then there was going to be a hearing in February of '93, but the county decided they were going to punt that even farther down the road. And so then it wasn't until May when we actually had the hearing. And finally, we had the hearing with the full county commission. Remember, there are 5 county commissioners. And it was a really kind of surreal thing, and you'll probably see photos coming up of that. But where actually they had these like lines outside, and they had a big no. If you're against it, then you stand over here. If you're yes, if you're for it, then you stand over here. And they're really kind of careful how many people they could get in. They had, of course, they didn't have the internet then to broadcast it, but they did have a TV in the parking garage next door, where I actually stood with the KKK, who was there to see it too. It was kind of surreal being in a parking garage right next to all these Klan members, but that's the way it was. And I always say this because I can never forget, there was an Alachua County sheriff, and it was actually a very large African-American guy who was a sheriff's deputy. And I'll never forget, he kind of walked right up behind one of these Klan members, kind of folded his arms like this, you know, and just stood as close as he could without touching him. And the guy just like turned around and realized that this guy was standing so close to him, and he just had to move away after that. But anyhow, a bottom line is that after about 6 hours of testimony, and it only takes 1 vote at the county did approve it on a 3-2 vote. Okay, and as of that time, we had an ordinance that protected LGBT, lesbian and gay people from discrimination in the county. Okay, well, so now we go to what we'll call the backlash with these things. And what happened was that opponents then created a PAC, which is a type of state political committee, to launch 2 things. They wanted to repeal the ordinance by petition, by a citizen-led petition. And by the way, that's the photo that was on the cover of the Gainesville Sun. That was controversial. And you see them holding death penalty for homosexuals, signage, and all that kind of stuff. So what they did is the county has a way that you can repeal an ordinance. The city can't do this, but the county you can. You can actually repeal an ordinance through a citizen-led petition. And that's the famous photo of Tom Petty that was in the Gainesville Sun. And that's me from behind. And that's his first wife, I believe. And okay, where was I? I'm sorry. So they actually had, they were getting petitions for 2 things. One was an ordinance that would just simply repeal it and take it away, so it's gone. But they got a little greedy, shall we say, and this is kind of what was happening then. They also wanted to pass a charter amendment. And a charter is really sort of the governing, document of how a county or a city runs. And they wanted to actually put a charter amendment that said that would prohibit any future ordinance protecting against discrimination based on sexual orientation, sexual preference, or similar characteristics. So they really just wanted to basically say, like, okay, so voters passed this thing, so the county can never pass such a thing again for homosexuals. Okay. There's actually 2 other places in the country that did this. The state of Colorado had a constitutional amendment placed by citizens that was similar to this. And the city of Cincinnati, Ohio had a similar charter amendment that prohibited these so-called gay rights ordinances. So we were sort of now became number three. And as it turned out, there were only 3 that did this back then. And I'll be talking a bit about that. So we were sort of unusual throughout the country on this, to have a charter amendment like this. Okay, well, I see with my time, I'm going to have to kind of go through this a little bit quicker. Here's more of the Klan that came for the hearing in the garage, watching it from there. So I'm going to try to speed this up a little bit, but basically we then saw that we had a real challenge on our hands. And so the Human Rights Council North Central formed that year in 1993. Another group called GARC, Gainesville Area Human Rights Campaign, formed even before that. So there were groups forming, and this is, by the way, outside the hearing right now. You had like for the ordinance, against the ordinance. And so we're at a point, and here I might as well point, that's me in the glasses right there. You can sort of see me right there between those 2 guys. That is me. And so basically we just saw that we had to get organized at this point. We really had never been organized before on this issue. And we got to get organized to do what? We had to get new people elected to office. So we had votes to actually pass these things. We had to educate the public about what this meant. We had to counter, disinformation and pure lies. It's something that we're sort of going through nowadays, which is sort of interesting. And so then we just had to rally our own folks and supporters, and certainly our straight allies, to get to put pressure also on commissioners and elected officials to get this stuff done. So so that's really what we need to do. So the first thing was trying to stop these petitions from happening. But basically they did happen. They got enough petitions. They got it on the ballot. So it was called Amendment 1 and Ordinance Repeal 1. I think it's kind of weird they're both called number 1. So to fast forward, basically what happened is we had a campaign we put together, raised money. We were very new at this. Some of us had some training in this, but we just didn't have the type of national and state support that we'd have later. This just barely existed. We had a little support from like the Human Rights Campaign and NGLTF out of Washington. There didn't exist any statewide group like Equality Florida at that time. So really, we're almost on our own in this, kind of learning as we go. Well, bottom line is on the November ballot, this passed on both measures passed at about 58% of the vote. Remember, this is a county-wide vote. And looking at the city vote, it was almost about 50-50. It was hard to tell exactly what it would be by precinct, but it was about 50-50 within Gainesville. So that was a real stinging defeat. There was no question about it. Their message was certainly special rights, that we're certainly from a Christian perspective immoral, or worse, that even our behavior was criminal, things like that. And we're just sort of basically saying that no, it's not special rights, it's equal rights. We're just asking for the same thing that everybody else has, and just the right to not be discriminated at a job, in employment, in public accommodations, simple things that you have to deal with every day in life. And by the way, this photo was our first Pride parade in '92. And if you ever thought that if you haven't seen drag queens lead off a parade, well, that has happened here in Gainesville, and they were quite proud, and we were also quite proud of them to do that. So bottom line is our not only did the ordinance get struck down, but we now had a charter amendment that said in the future we can't do this again. And by the way, this slide right here shows one other thing that we did. One of the first things we did when the political committee was formed was to actually show on public record and publish who actually gave to that political committee. And remember, back then, no internet. You couldn't just get online and look at the elections office site and find these things like you can now. And we would publish this, and this is something that Human Rights Council did, one of the first things we did. And it was amazing how people started giving much less money when they realized that this was actually public record and we can get it out. And people would boycott certain businesses, yes, that were supporting our opponents. But the public records laws are very strong in Florida, and we were happy to do that, make sure people knew. So I see we don't have too much time, so I'm going to move through this a little bit more. And I think, Rick, we might be done with these right now. I think that's the last slide. If you want to take that off right now, I'm just going to go ahead and try to finish this up in about 10 minutes. But what eventually did happen was that we worked with Lambda Legal in the 90s. They were actually sued to have this charter amendment overturned as unconstitutional. And in May of 1996, the probably the most important gay rights decision from the Supreme Court, even bigger than marriage probably, was the 1996 Romer v. Evans a ruling, which basically said, Colorado, you can't do that. You can't just say a certain group of people can't petition their government for having equal rights. And so that invalidated Colorado. So now it was Cincinnati and Alachua County that was left. And fortunately, our Rick Smith, a county judge, ruled purely on that grounds in November of '96 and said, no, that's unconstitutional. You can't do that. And threw out the charter amendment. But it did keep the repeal in place, because that's just a temporary thing. It's just like it's gone. It didn't mean we couldn't go back and do it again. Okay, so basically what happened from then is we then realized, okay, we got to get the right people elected. And I'm going to run through this pretty quick at this point, but basically on the city commission level, we worked really hard, and in 1996 we got Pegeen Hanrahan and Sandy Calkins elected and got rid of incumbents, and we suddenly had really a pro-gay majority. And then we worked hard in '97 and '98 to pass a gay rights ordinance then, and that did pass. And there was quite a bit of backlash to that, but it did pass. And then as we moved into the 2000s, we also wanted to amend the city ordinance to include transgender protections, because that was something that really was not thought much of in the 90s, but suddenly in the 2000s was very much on people's radar. And we realized at that point we should have done it in '98, because it's always better to sort of bundle these things together than try to do them piecemeal. But we wanted to correct that. So in beginning in 2007 into 2008, we lobbied our city commission to do that. And again, just briefly, that was a very divisive campaign. But I can tell you that the difference back then with our opponents compared to what we had is we really had an amazing amount of support from both statewide organizations. It's amazing what 15 years will do, and from national, local support. We had one of the biggest campaigns ever done, $100,000 campaign plus. And basically what happened through countering language about bathroom, about men in bathrooms, if you remember that this is what that was going to do, and all this sort of really inflammatory stuff. And for our message, this is just about saying no to any kind of discrimination, not leaving anybody behind, even transgender folks. And basically what happened is that this then had one of the highest turnouts ever in a city commission election, one of the highest turnouts for young people too. And that in the city, we were able to fight back a repeal effort on this, which they did get on the ballot. In 2008, we defeated it by a 58% vote, ironically the same number as before. And it was really quite a victory, and it really set back folks in this community that wanted to oppose these ordinances, and sent a message, I think, to other places around the country that were doing this, like in North Carolina And in Michigan, there were some places using this sort of, scary bathroom boogeyman sort of language and opposition. I don't have a lot of time, unfortunately, to go into that, and I'm kind of gonna have to wrap it up here pretty close so we can do some Q&A. But basically, I just want to just say that, since then it's been amazing since that was passed and repeal was defeated in 2009. In 2010, we had openly gay. City mayor, Mayor Lowe for the city of Gainesville was elected. We had openly lesbian commissioner elected, Helen Warren in 2014. And just this year, we had an openly lesbian county commissioner, Mary Alford, elected. And I just think it shows you the progress that we're making, that it's just not a big deal or a very small deal for most people what your sexual orientation is at this time. And a bittersweet victory happened in 2013, that 20 years later, after the county commission's owned anti-discrimination ordinance was repealed, we got it, or excuse me, had been voted on the first time in 2013. We now were able to get the county commission rather quickly to get a fully inclusive, trans-inclusive ordinance in effect in 2013. And that was that first photo at the beginning where we saw. And the last thing I'm going to say, and then we'll take it up, open up Q&A if we can. You might have noticed that there was something relevant about this on the 2020 November ballot, but there was this charter amendment that was the so-called county cleanup language charter amendment that basically took out unconstitutional language, because only voters can do that. And thanks to Alachua County voters, they overwhelmingly got rid of that anti-gay language that was there, that wouldn't allow any protections, even though it was unconstitutional to do that. But that language was finally taken out only like a month ago. So that's where we are today, and I'd be happy now to open it up for any questions and answers.
All right, well, thanks, Bob, for the inspiring and sobering thoughts that you presented. I'm going to ask people to raise their hands electronically if you can. You go to the participant button, and in the window you click on raise hand. If you can't do that, open up your image and raise your hand physically, and I might be able to see you. We have two people on different screens, but I can be glad to do that. Margaret, go ahead.
Yes, thanks, Bob. My heart breaks to think of all the battles we've been through, especially you, but I've certainly, as an observer, been through many of these too. We've known each other for 20 years at least, and it's just wonderful to see you today. Another great fighter for this was Terry Fleming, our good friend, who died this year. He started, or at least ran, but I think he also started a real support system for high schoolers who were struggling with their gay feelings. Could you tell a little bit about the history of the center that Terry began and ran?
Yeah. Terry Fleming, who folks don't know, died this year, earlier this year, very unexpectedly. But he came to Gainesville area, I believe, in 1999. So he was not there for that first 1990s activism that was happening. But boy, when he showed up, he just threw himself into it. And one of his biggest things, and probably I would say is the main thing he worked on, was the Pride Center, because he really thought we needed a place for LGBT people, but also for young people too. There's a little support in some of the schools, for things like this, but a place where, no judgment kind of place where you can come. And I know, especially for young people, they have been ramping up that kind of programming lately. But the center still exists. It's doing very well. People come to our town and can't believe the kind of Pride Center that we have, even from big cities. They're just blown away. And we welcome anyone to come and check it out.
Who is running it now, Bob?
Yeah, I think it's still pretty much who's left on the board. At some point, they may hire an executive director to actually, quote, run it. But the board is still there and running it. You know, Tracy Mormon and a lot of other ones there. Yeah.
Could you tell us about the Pride festivals and how they developed and what type of response they received?
Yeah, and I'm glad you asked that because I mean this is actually something that I co-started back that first one in '92, and I guess for me it was all about visibility. I you know, people need to see us, and I just think people, you know, before the '90s knew we were sort of out there, but just didn't see what we were doing or anything, and I think that's just helped our opponents sort of frame, you know, what we were about, so Pride festivals are nothing new, but for Gainesville, they were new. For smaller towns, somewhat new. And really, except I think for 1 year that we were sort of transitioning in the 90s, we've had them ever since. And not that, but it's not just the festival. We do a Pride Week. We have an awards dinner. First one was in 2000. I was the first award winner with 2 other people that year. Proud to get it, but you know, it was. Really just wanted to put us on the map as we're just part of this community. We're just like anyone else in this community and really like living here. And I think this is the point I just want to say. I think if we didn't care so much about Gainesville and really liked living here, you know, we wouldn't get so maybe upset about some of this stuff, especially some of this stuff you saw in the early part. But these are really attacking our lives and our families. And we like it in Gainesville, and we think that it should be an open place for anyone, no matter who you are. And sexual orientation and gender identity is just one aspect of that. And so we just really want to make sure that through the laws and policies, and even through the court of public opinion, that this is a really great place to live, and for anyone from, you know, whatever walk of life they come from. That's what drives me.
All right. Phil, do you have a comment? Unmute yourself. Unmute, please.
There I am. Yeah. Okay. Fine. Yeah. I really appreciated your talk, and I was wondering whether you might be able to share with me or help me understand the terminology that goes into the title of LGBTQ. Okay. Where I come from and in my lifespan, queer was a term of derogatory term that really spoke negatively about homosexuality in any kind. And all of a sudden, I find it tacked on to the end of this terminology that you guys are using. And I'm wondering, what value is it in the development of your image with the community and gaining equality and equal rights in the whole business?
Yeah, that's a good question. And you know, these terms sort of change over time, you know, and there's no way we would have used queer, you know, back in the 80s or 70s. But I can tell you, even beginning in the 90s, the groups would, usually younger people, and would form. There was actually a group called Queer Nation that even formed in the late 80s. And I think what they're trying to do, especially young people, is they want to take back these words. They don't want to say, like, you get to use that word as a negative word. We're going to take it back. You know, we're going to own it, you know, and in effect redefine it, you know what it means. And I'm going to do it on our terms. Now, this was a bit different for us as older folks, you know, and even then I was in, you know, in my mid 30s or so, and you know, in university town, that's getting pretty old. But here there's 20-year-olds, 18-year-olds coming out. Nowadays, like, it's amazing. They don't even want to use any terms. You know, it's like, don't try to define me. I'm, you know, gender fluid, or I'm gender nonconforming, or there's all sorts of words, but they don't even like to use gay anymore, or lesbian. And so I think it's just showing that every generation sort of has a different way of looking at how they want to be described. But with the queer thing, I sort of understand because it's like, we're going to take that word back. You know, we're going to own it and not make it a negative word anymore. And that's sort of the way I see it. And I think we've actually been somewhat successful in doing that, because you certainly see it even on mainstream media. You see them using the Q word, as we say. Yeah. Interesting. but it'll probably change in the future again. Yeah, hold on 10 more years, and we'll have some other terminology.
I don't have 10 years.
Yeah. All right.
Okay, other questions or comments?
I have another one.
Go ahead, Margaret.
Bob, you did not mention the most horrible part of the past. There were 3 murders of gay people here. What, in the late 90s, was it? I remember it vividly, but it was.
Yeah, I mean,
An author, a man I bought furniture from at Cox, a professor.
Yeah,
It was incredible.
yeah, I know, especially the professor at, in meat science, I think was his thing. Yeah, very some high-profile murders. I know, and let's not forget the whole AIDS epidemic. You know, that was coming out of.
Oh, yeah.
I grew up with that in the 1970s and 80s, but you know, it's just all part of what was happening at the time. I do want to mention the AIDS epidemic because I think that, as horrible as that was, a small silver lining that came out of that is it really got gay and lesbian people organized and realized, you know, you got to get organized to make change. And here's, I guess, the one message I would like to leave a group with is like, these type of policies and ordinances and laws just don't happen by accident, or don't happen just because you happen to live in what you think is a progressive community. I mean, it takes hard work to get them passed. You got to get commissioners and elected officials to get it passed. You got to get support in the community, and that takes some time and effort, you know. But ultimately, it's very doable. It doesn't even take a huge amount of people in a core group to get it done with a city the size of Gainesville. And I think we just sort of realized. I guess one last thing I want to say is what was the most gratifying thing was the straight ally support in this community. And we thought it would be pretty big, but people were just, you know, non-gay people were just amazing. Were just so much they wanted. This issue was so important to them because it was like a benchmark for living in a liberal progressive community. I think to be able to have these kind of protections for LGBT folks, and there's no question that was probably one of the most important groups to help us, you know, make this happen and continue to this day.
Great. Anybody else have comments or questions?
I have a funny little story, if I could tell it
Okay.
with regard to this. For the election where we were trying to get the city commission to include this in their non-discrimination. I was one of those who volunteered to stand on a street corner with a sign on election day. So I'm out there, I was in my 70s. I'm out there with a great big sign, 8 o'clock in the morning at 8th and University Avenue. And lots of people came by and honked and so forth for it and against, mostly for. And 2 ladies in their 60s and 70s both were just floored that somebody my age would care enough about this issue to be out there on the corner. So I really think I kind of changed their minds about the whole issue. They were in awe of me. And then as I was standing there, I was very close to the curb, and this very nice car drove up, and a woman who was, I would say, about 80, very handsome, beautifully coiffed, white hair, pearls, diamonds on her hands, you know, painted fingernails. I could see in the car window, it was so close. And I thought, oh my, isn't that a nice looking woman? And as she drove off, when the light changed and she drove off, she gave me the finger. I thought that was my badge of honor for that day.
Probably was the best dressed finger you'd ever gotten.
Right.
Jack, go ahead. Unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you very much. History is certainly important. I noticed in all the pictures, there were no blacks. And I'm wondering, obviously, there are members of that group who are also facing the same dilemmas. And my concern, as some of you already know, is Black Lives Matter.
Mhm.
So the question is, are the blacks being brought into your movement? And by the same token, just like the women voting thing, are you willing to jump on the bandwagon and support Black Lives Matter as now the upfront discriminated group?
Yeah, yeah. Well, first, I do want to just correct you a little bit. There actually was a very important person, Patricia Lassiter, who was in some of those photos, who is African American. She's since moved up to Georgia and is very active, as you can imagine, right now in Georgia. But yeah, we actually did have some black folks in leadership positions. Not a lot. That is true, and it was always a struggle to try to get that. Sometimes more and more. Sometimes we thought that, especially folks that are from Gainesville, because many of us really weren't from Gainesville. Like I came to university here, but folks that came from Gainesville, and especially I think if they're African American, being out at that time was a very sort of iffy thing for a lot of folks that came from Gainesville. But we did have some African American support, and like I said, Patricia Lassiter was actually a spokeswoman for us. And actually was one of the protesters too that at the sit-in that was taken away with that. But yeah, Black Lives Matter. Yeah, I mean, part of the whole thing is we need to have everybody on board. To when you're a minority, a sexual minority like LGBT people are, 5 to 10% of the population. We have to have support of other people. And the African American community, especially in a place like Gainesville, that's fairly large compared to a lot of communities, that was very, very important. We worked with Rodney Long, I know, was one of our first supporters. Rodney Long was mayor commissioner and was very supportive with us back then. And we courted him and worked with him, and other commissioners as well. Certainly the So that's always been on our minds. When we had our in 2008, when we brought in folks from outside, we had African American folks on our team to defeat that charter amendment as well, and we had them in ads and things like that as well. That I thought was pretty well represented. But but coalitions, so Black Lives Matter, everything like that is so important in the LGBT movement. I know with the Human Rights Council that's important. And we certainly endorse that movement here and participated as much as we can.
Okay, thanks.
Shirley?
I just wanted to say one of the nicest programs that the Florida Free Speech Forum had was to bring several high school students who were working with this sexual identity thing come and talk to the group at Free Speech Forum, and their presentations were so wonderful, so heartwarming, and it was written up in the Gainesville Sun from the perspective of these young people in high school and how successful they were being. It was a great program. I don't know whether it's archived or not, but it was very well written.
Yeah, I would always encourage looking at the young people. I mean, they're the future, and what's going to be happening. And I would just say that I was like amazed the difference in that fight in the early 90s, dealing with young people, especially compared to say in the late 2000s when we were working with the city. Like we would go talk to people on campus, and it didn't matter, guys, young women, young men, fraternity brothers, sorority sisters, they were so supportive of gay rights and even trans rights. It was just amazing the difference, because it was not like that in the early 90s necessarily. So,
It's probably time for us to come back to the Free Speech Forum and do it again.
wow.
But now everybody's in love with Pete. So he's a great, great advertiser for us.
Thanks. The final question is, what's happened to the opposition these days? Are they still vocal in any way?
Well, it was interesting. In 2013, so it was still about 7 years ago or so, we were wondering what kind of opposition would be at the county commission, and it was very little. I think it's almost they're a little bit afraid of us. I think they've seen how organized that we can get, and how we can organize. I think they also knew they didn't have the votes at the commission, so having the votes is always so important. but they were there. We've seen some opposition even with conversion therapy, which has been something lately that we've gotten passed at the city and county commission, but not a lot. So I think they're probably holding on to the statewide level prohibitions right now. So far, we don't have any statewide protections, and of course in Congress as well. But I think for local communities like this, definitely much less on the opposition front. But it's still out there to some degree.
Well, thank you so much, Bob. Let's all thank him. Fantastic presentation.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you.
And next week, come back at this time. We're going to be addressing the Johns Committee of the 1950s and their persecution of gays and lesbians and the impact that had on the University of Florida. So look forward to seeing you then. Thanks so much, everyone.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Setting it up.